Hi, I'm William Stewart. Welcome back to our verse-by-verse study on the book of Galatians. Once more, I'm glad you're here. Such a wonderful book and wonderful study from our Apostle Paul, who wrote it to the Galatians probably between 50 and 55 AD, just after the first missionary journey. The land was relatively rural, but also had a significant number of Jewish population within it, which influences how Paul writes this book. If you've seen the prior videos, you'll understand that Paul was writing to them to correct them in regards to their leaving the faith in their Christian walk after they had accepted Jesus Christ by faith alone, apparently, in his death and resurrection. But then in their Christian life, they were returning to the law or to some legalistic system, perhaps based somewhat on the law. We don't really know. So we're in chapter 3 today, verses 4 and 5, and Paul, in moving to chapter 3, has left really his introduction in the first two chapters, claiming his authority as apostles, so they should look to him, and reminding them how they were saved by grace. And he then chides them, saying, here you begin in faith. Who cheated you or bewitched you or fooled you, and you think now you have to walk by the law? So in verse 4 today, he says, have you suffered so many things in vain? Otherwise, you have accepted Christ by faith. There's probably been some element of hardship, persecution in living a Christian life in Galatia within the Roman Empire. And he says that in vain or vainly, if yet in vain. So he repeats it in a sense for emphasis. Greek, the original language of the Bible, instead of using a lot of adverbs and adjectives, tends to use repetition to drive a point home for emphasis. So I think he's emphasizing here that they could have suffered in vain. Interestingly, here the word for suffer is in what is called the aorist tense in the Greek, meaning it was a limited time. Otherwise, perhaps the time that they had walked in faith was limited to some element of time. We're not sure which, by which now perhaps they had left and were not undergoing that suffering, or just perhaps had left their life by faith. We're not sure. But the use of the aorist here of a limited period of time or a completed period of time, of what somebody would call in the Slavic languages like Russian or Polish the perfective tense. So in verse 5, he therefore that ministereth to you in the Spirit. And really here the word for ministereth means to supply or furnish. So he supplied, he's talking about himself. He supplied in the Spirit, or supplied to them the Holy Spirit. Otherwise, remember last time we recounted that we received the Holy Spirit at salvation. Not only his power and ability to work in us and mature us, but as a seal to our salvation. If you don't have the Spirit, you're not a Christian, period. Romans 8:9. So when Paul's saying that he came and gave them the Spirit, he's indicating that he's the one, particularly in the first missionary journey, and maybe before, maybe after, we're not sure, provided them the means of salvation or the knowledge of salvation. This particularly would have been something to the Jews because the Holy Spirit is promised to the Jews ultimately with the new covenant at the end of Isaiah 59 and also in Ezekiel 36. And he said he worketh miracles among you. So Paul did miracles in Galatia. Again, the first missionary journey. This is one of the early books of the Bible, of the epistles, the letters after Christ came, the epistles telling us how we live and obey in the church, along with 1 Corinthians. So in these times, apparently the miracles were still extant, living, possible. They disappeared over time. If you read in the book of Acts, and they aren't really talked about actively in the epistles as a foundation or an element of maturity or Christian life, and something we should seek. It is discussed in 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, not in a complimentary way. I think something Paul is tolerating as these works, these miracles disappear, as stated in 1 Corinthians 13 and Matthew 11:13. They were there particularly for the Jews because the Jews want to see signs. Christ provided these signs. So did Peter and Paul also, as he went to the Jews first. He provided these signs as a way to show the diaspora Jews in those communities that what the message was consistent about Messiah, consistent with the prophecy of the Old Testament. And so they were important. But after the church was established and matured, as we read in Ephesians 4, verses 11 to 16, they were not needed and indeed disappeared, the miraculous gifts. And in doing so, spreading the gospel and proving himself by miracles, he did this not by the law, but by faith, indicating to the Galatians, you should do the same. Live by faith. Okay, so what do we learn today? Paul is emphasizing to the Galatians that as they have begun by faith, by receiving Jesus Christ, again by faith alone in his death and resurrection, they should not now give it up and not live their Christian life by faith. Thus, everything being vain, done in vain and emptiness that he had taught them. And indeed, he himself, who brought them salvation and brought them and proved his ministry and power from God and his authority from God by the miracles, he himself did this from faith and not by the works of the law. Okay, we'll continue in this marvelous chapter. There's just so much rich information to come. I hope you'll join me next time. Goodbye for now.